All right, I'm just going to give a brief outline of what my presentation is actually about, whilst I wait for the battery pack. I'm going to start off by giving a historical context of resource data management. That would then be followed by a distinction between resource data management on the one hand and open science. This will be followed up by the quality-related aspects of resource data management. Then I will describe the relevance of the concept of fairness to this topic. Then I'll go into a bit of a description of the fairness resources that actually exist before finally concluding. So first things first, the historical context of research data management. Scientific research has been with us for a long time. And in the days of science past, you'll see that people made use of crude instruments as well as paper-based research. And that has now changed to the point where current research is actually based on technology to a large degree rather than paper-based research. Now, it should be pointed out that throughout this entire time, people have, or rather scientists have been managing their research data in some form. Now, some people might be forgiven for perhaps assuming that research data management only emerged after the open access movement actually started off after the 2003 Berlin Declaration on Open Access. But if you actually look at a few examples, which I'll just point out right now, you can actually see that there are historic examples, that actually demonstrate that RDM has actually been practiced for some time. Okay, I'll just remain stationary in that case. So the first example is of Charles Darwin and his field notebooks that he kept in the 1830s, which actually demonstrated how he managed his research data. Second example is of Alexander Fleming, the scientist behind the discovery of penicillin, who also kept laboratory notebooks. Another scientist is Anna McLaren, who actually kept a laboratory notebook as she conducted, oh yeah, it's working. All right, feel free. All right, there's Anna, thanks. There's Anna McLaren, who conducted research on in vitro fertilization, and she kept laboratory notebooks from the 1950s to the 70s, as you can see here. All these are paper-based, as you would take note. The second example is of clinical trials, or rather clinical data management, which actually emanates from clinical trials, which, believe it or not, have been around for centuries, actually for millennia. And clinical data management emerged a few decades ago. You can go as far back as the 70s to see in the 1970s, it was actually more cleric or paper-based. But in the modern day times, you find that it's actually more computer-based. But that is a form of data management, research data management. And the final example is from the earliest research data archives. We have the Roper Center, which was set up in the 1940s and became operational in the 50s, but it wasn't really a research data archive as what we imagine it in a modern day society. The first one of this kind was actually the Central Archive that was actually set up in 1960 in Germany, and it made research data openly accessible. Another example is the ICPSR, which was set up in 1962 in the US. And the last one is the Steinmetz Archive, which was actually established in the Netherlands in 1964. It has since been incorporated into the Netherlands Institute for Scientific Information. The main takeaway from all this is that research data management is not a recent development. The next point now, let's look at research data management versus open science. If you have a look at this taxonomy from Foster's website, you'll see a nice representation of the different components of open science. You'll notice that there's open access, open data, open reproducible research, but there's no mention of research data management. There's actually a separate taxonomy for research data management. It's a bit of a simplification. Generally speaking, research data management is depicted through research data life cycles, which generally depict the journey that research data actually go through. starting off with a planning phase, then going through the active data management phase, and finishing off with the passive phase, during which research data are actually made openly accessible. So what we can see from this is that open science incorporates things such as open access and open data. And there are some overlaps between research data management and open science, primarily when research data are actually made openly accessible. However, the key takeaway is that research data management and open science are not the same thing. So now let's actually get into the meat of the topic, quality-related aspects of research data management. Let's start off with the definition of what quality actually is. This is a philosophical definition of it. You can view quality as an attribute or a property, characteristic of an object. The key operative words there are attribute and property. Now, generally speaking, you'd have a quality management system in order to manage quality. And this is defined in terms of ISO 9001 as a set of policies, processes, and procedures required for planning and execution. It's interesting to note that ISOs are used as a form of standardizing quality to a certain degree. And so it's quite significant that this definition actually comes from an ISO. Now, let's have a look at a definition of research data management in order to actually get to the core of why quality should actually apply, or why it applies to research data management. In this sense, research data management, if we look at a working definition, can be defined as a process which entails planning for the manner in which research data will be managed during the research process, and then controlling those various aspects. The key operative word to take note of here is process. As you saw, that was actually part of the definition of a quality management system. Can you see the link? Now let's have a look at the goals of research data management. There are at least 3 goals that researchers should be cognizant of. The first one is that they should at least assure that the data are capable of supporting the analysis. Secondly, the operations performed on the research data should actually be traceable. And thirdly, the data should facilitate some form of reuse. You can see the operative word there, assure, which actually surfaces again. And what this tells us, if you actually carry on with this chain of thought, is that generally speaking, when you have quality assurance at play, there actually needs to be some kind of quality control measures in place. Those are the core components of a quality management system. Now, the idea of data quality is not something that is actually novel. If you have a look at components with ISO 25012, which was published around in 2008, you can see that it contains components of data quality, the various attributes that need to be considered, what they mean, examples, and the metrics that should be taken into consideration. Now, the idea of also applying quality management to research data management is also not a novel concept. It can be traced back to the capability maturity integration model that was actually published in 2002 by Carnegie Mellon University. In 2014, there was a paper that was actually published by Quinn, Croston, and Kirkland that actually applied quality aspects to research data management, and they adapted it to an RDM-based capability maturity model. Now, this did not look at research data management in its entirety per se, but looked at quality control aspects relating to policies, quality control procedures, as well as data quality assurance. Now, all of this is really important because there are several factors that actually influence the quality of research data, which is why one must actually take this into account. The most important are the relationships between time and information, also on the one hand, and also the manner in which research data are collected or generated. I'll start by considering the first one. The fact is that events can take place, but research data might not necessarily be collected at that same point or recorded at that same point. There might be a lag in time. So what you find is that an event will take place, but then the data collection will only take place afterwards. During that time interval, as you can see there, there's always some information loss and degradation, and this ultimately affects the quality of the data. If, let's say, several months pass between an event and when the event is actually only recorded, there'll be an information loss there. And if the data collected and only cleaned weeks later, there's also an information loss, and quality actually reduces as well, or declines in the process. This ultimately can affect the scientific validity of the data. The other thing to consider now is the manner in which the research data are actually collected or generated. The two things to consider in this respect: observations and recording of the data. So as it turns out, there are problems associated with observations that are made directly by human beings. You can have human error that comes into play. People make mistakes. There's a lot of subjectivity, which can lead to bias with regards to how people interpret research data. There might be inconsistent practices regarding the manner in which research data are actually observed or collected. In some cases, research data are actually observed indirectly by humans, so you might approach another human and ask them about their observation. There might be problems with regards to the recall, the degree to which a person can actually recollect a certain event, issues of reliability based on the source of the information, and the validity of the data that are actually collected from the actual source. That can also affect the quality of the research data. Now, sometimes you'll see that there are also problems that can be associated with the recording of the data. So not just observation, but the recording of the data. There can be human error that also crops up again. So you can see similar problems, inconsistencies with the data, the recall problem is there as well, and cognition, the degree to which at least people comprehend the data that they've actually observed. Now, some people might think that you can resolve this problem by relying on machines or instruments, but you'll find that there's several problems that also emerge. Instruments or machines can malfunction, they may be used improperly, they might not actually be precise in terms of the measurements that they take, there might not be very accurate readings that the instruments take. There might be problems with the sampling rate. There's several problems you can see there. Noise can also influence the actual data observations and recordings. There might also be a lack of traceability, which is a huge problem with regards to the quality of research data. So the main takeaway here is that there are quality-related aspects associated with research data, primarily because this can actually affect the traceability of the data, the degree to which the data can actually be reused, and ultimately the scientific validity of the research data. So what's fairness got to do with it? And I've drawn some inspiration from Tina Turner's hit single, What's Love Got to Do With It, in this case. So the question is, what's fairness got to do with it? Who needs fair data when research data can simply be made open? I'll try to answer that question now. Right, so to understand this really well, you need to understand the nature of the modern academic research publication model. So research data can be published as supplementary data along with journal articles that are published. Research data can also be published as standalone data papers that are published in data journals. And research data can actually be deposited in research data repositories. These can be domain-specific repositories, as you can see there, or they can be generic/multidisciplinary repositories. These can all be linked to an institutional research data repository, and the example that we've given there is SunScholar Data, Stellenbosch University's very own institutional research data repository. Now, the problem, though, is that we're currently dealing with machines assisting humans with conducting their research, and the machines face several obstacles, and these may be viewed as firewalls. There are 3 firewalls to consider. The first one is machines may actually be denied access to the text, let's say if the data are not openly accessible. Secondly, the data may be accessible, but they might be in machine-unfriendly file formats, such as tables and figures, which the machines just can't comprehend. And you may find that the data actually have links that are broken, that might not be persistent links, and they may be subject to link rot over time. And it's against this background that the FAIR data principles were actually formulated a few years ago. They stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or rather it as a concept stands for that. Now, the FAIR data principles are not only meant for human readability, but they apply to machine readability and machine actionability. simply because it's not realistic to expect, let's say, one researcher to go through hundreds of thousands of research articles or data sets. But this is something that is easier for machines, provided that the data are accessible and machine actionable. Now, this is based on a paper that was published by Barend Mons, who's a leading fair data specialist. And he estimates that about 80% of the research data out there are actually useless. This is primarily because they don't have any metadata, you can't find the data, and there are no links associated with that. So if you look at the second block, I'll call that block B, you find that the data can be findable if they have some form of persistent identifier. If you supplement that with metadata, then you wind up with fair metadata, which is block C. To add on to that, you can make the data accessible as well. However, this is not always possible. Sometimes you may deal with sensitive research data that cannot be made openly accessible. So you wind up at block D, the one with the red there, with the red data elements, and you have restricted fair data. If you can make the data set, the underlying data set openly accessible, what you find is that you would have open access fair data. However, the end goal is to actually wind up with something like what you see in block F, where everything is green. That is openly accessible fair data that are actually functionally linked, so that they can actually support knowledge discovery through computational analysis. This is primarily something that can happen to facilitate machine actionability. That is essentially the end goal. Now, from a quality standpoint, it's interesting enough that GoFair, which is one of the institutions behind the formulation of the fair data principles, indicates that quality issues are actually not addressed by the fair data principles. Now, this is probably debatable. Personally, I think that's a demonstrably false statement, or at least, at the very least, it can be qualified so you can actually stipulate which specific quality attributes are not addressed by the fair data principles. Because as I pointed out previously, the fair data principles are actually attributes or properties associated with research data. And as we saw from the definition of quality, quality relates to properties or attributes associated with an object. So one must at least infer that the fair data principles must actually be associated with quality. Now, the problem that one can see from this is that, and this might go back to Barend Mons' idea that most research data are actually not fair. If you use this tool known as Repository Finder, you can actually have a look at the research data repositories that are actually registered out there and see how many of them are actually fair, compliant. This is actually linked with the Re3 Data, which is actually the registry of research data repositories. It has over 2,700 listed research data repositories. Now, if one actually does a search on Repository Finder, what you'll find is that only 1,905 of these repositories are actually linked to Repository Finder. And if you try to see how many of them are actually fair compliant, in terms of the Enabling Fair Data project, you'll see that only 249 of them are fair compliant. And if you do search based on the Fair is Fair project, which is the other option, you find that only 128 of the repositories are actually fair compliant. So what you'll find is that in terms of the repositories that are listed on Re3 Data, less than 10% of them are actually fair compliant. And if you just go along with everything that's listed on Repository Finder, less than 15% of these research data repositories are actually fair compliant. But of course, it's worth remembering that not all research data are actually made openly accessible via repositories. So what you then find is something like this. We're at a crossroad. We don't want to be on the quadrant on the left bottom hand side there where the research data are closed and not fair. Ideally, we'd actually want to be in the top right hand side where the research data are actually open and fair. Unfortunately, it seems like we're probably on the left top side, on the top left hand side, with research data that are actually open but not fair. So a lot of data that are actually open but they're not fair at all. And the key takeaway from this is that that's actually where we'd want to be. Fairness does seem to be something that's associated with quality as well. Now let's have a look at some resources that actually allow us to then assess the fairness of research data. There are at least 5 resources that I'll go through. The first one is the Fair Data Maturity Model. Remember, I discussed maturity models being applied to research data earlier on. The Fair Data Maturity Model was actually developed by the Research Data Alliance, and it basically allows an institute to actually apply it to their research data management service offering. You're free to use it in any way in this case, and you can see the degree to which the system is actually compliant with the findable, accessible, interoperable, or reusable metrics. You can use a scale to see whether or not the practices are actually not consistent in an organization, or whether they've actually been fully implemented. And you can actually look at the elements that are actually useful, important, or essential insofar as the fair data principles are actually concerned. The main thing to actually take from this is that this is a capability maturity model that assesses the fairness of a system, and it can be applied to research data management offerings. You can even have a more granular breakdown of the various elements of the fair data principles in order to see what has actually been fully implemented, what's in the process of being fully implemented, etc. The next tool is Data Stewardship Wizard. This is actually a data management planning tool. And the way it works is that it allows researchers to actually complete a smart questionnaire that then allows them to generate a data management planning form afterwards. Now, it is actually based on what are known as the core requirements for data management plans that you can actually see listed there. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing about this is that you can actually map those core requirements of data management plans to the fair data principles. So that's if you look at the column on the second column from the right-hand side there, in each of these tables, you see that each requirement from the core data management core requirements for DMPs can be mapped out to a specific requirement from the fair data management, from the fair, fair data principles. Let me get that right. Now, when the research actually then completes the data management plan or the SMART questionnaire, a data management plan is actually generated, and it has metrics that are also displayed that provide a summary of the degree to which the researcher has actually complied with the fair data principles. So it's not as if a researcher has to go and complete the core requirements of the DMPs and then match them by themselves with the fair data principles. This is done automatically in the background, and you can see that displayed there for the overall project, as well as the different stages of the research data management lifecycle, which is how the researcher completes the form. Now, another tool then is fair self-assessment tool. This is used to actually assess the fairness of repositories as a whole, in this case. It allows anyone to actually just have a look at their repository, and then they actually fill in a form, and based on their responses, you get results that actually show the degree to which that repository is actually fair compliant. It doesn't go into the nitty-gritties of the individual research data sets, unfortunately. But that is something that is addressed by this tool, which is known as the Fuji Automated Fair Data Assessment Tool. It's still undergoing testing right now. It's in the beta phase, as I understand it. And the way that it works is it allows one to actually just click on the blue button. So if one was to click that, you'd then enter a URL, such as a DOI associated with the data set. And what happens then is that the tool conducts an assessment, and it generates a report in less than about a minute. And in this case, there's a data set that shows up there, and there's a score, 54% in that case. And you can see that there's also score, individual score for each of the individual elements of the fair data principles. Now, one can actually click on the detailed report to actually see why a certain score is actually positive or perhaps negative. That's specifically for the ones with the question marks. So you can actually drill down into the details and actually enhance your product offering. There's another tool which also does a similar thing. This is known as the Fair Evaluator. A person simply has to enter the details of an associated data set. So it's not specifically for an entire repository, but for individual data sets. Once such information is actually entered, it then generates a report and actually indicates the areas in which the data set actually complies with the fair data principles, and the areas in which one would actually want to improve on. Those are the red ones. And one can actually click on those. And the example here is for the identifier. The reason why that identifier is actually red is because it's actually not a persistent identifier. So you can actually realize that, okay, you actually need to make some changes and actually make use of a persistent link, and then that will go green. Now, before I conclude, I just wanted to point out that the main takeaway is that there are tools out there that then allow people to actually comply with the fair data principles, and that actually supports resource data management, albeit indirectly. So the key takeaways now, if we actually look at all of them, is firstly, resource data management is not a recent development. Resource data management is not the same thing as open science, so you can have resource data that are fair but not necessarily open. Thirdly, resource data management has a quality management aspect. The fair data principles appear to have a quality management dimension as well. The fairness resources facilitate compliance with the fair data principles and indirectly resource data management. The last point here that I'd like the audience to take note of is that the resources which facilitate compliance with the fair data principles actually serve a quality management function, whilst incidentally contributing to the openness of resource data. And I actually wrote down another point, because it's quite important. I made this point here because this is due to the relationship between resource data management, fairness, and openness. Resource data management actually enables or supports fairness, but it also facilitates openness. So this is not to denigrate openness or anything of that sort, but rather, in order for us to ensure and control the quality of resource data, we must not prioritize openness at the expense of fairness. Rather, resource data should be fair in the first place and then open, so that we can end up with openly accessible, fair resource data that are functionally linked and machine actionable, so that they can actually support knowledge discovery. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It was quite a mouthful, or a maskful. And I think I'm just going to borrow voters' comment of this morning. I still need to process that. And to be fair, we are providing you with time now to go and process what has been said by the two speakers. So we will leave now for some refreshments out in the open, and then we will come back at 3 o'clock to resume. Thank you. See you just now.
No, it's fine. Luckily, you guys have the other mic right there. Yeah, just pull it. Wasn't even sore.